December 1941. The United States had just been dragged into the deadliest conflict in human history. Pearl Harbor was still smoldering. American battleships lay twisted and broken at the bottom of the harbor. Over 200 to 400 Americans were dead. And in Washington, something even more dangerous was happening. Something that could have cost the Allies the entire war. A British Prime Minister had effectively taken control of the White House. Winston Churchill had arrived with what he called a portable war room, a complete command center, installed in the second floor of the American president's residence. British officers walked freely through those halls. They had unrestricted access to Franklin Roosevelt at any hour of day or night. They brought maps, intelligence reports, strategic plans. They were shaping the future of the war. Meanwhile, American military officers were barred from the second floor. They waited in hallways like servants. They were summoned only when needed. The most powerful nation on earth was being treated as a junior partner in its own capital. One man saw this for what it truly was. Not a diplomatic courtesy, not an alliance convenience, but a calculated strategic maneuver that could doom millions of American soldiers to die fighting the wrong war in the wrong places for the wrong reasons. His name was George Catlett Marshall. And what he did next would reshape the entire Second World War. But here is what makes this story truly remarkable. Marshall did not storm into the Oval Office demanding change. He did not write angry memos. He did not threaten resignation. He simply refused to enter a room. That single act of defiance, that quiet moment of principle in a Washington hallway, would establish American dominance in the Allied command structure for the remainder of the war. It would save countless lives. It would determine how and where the decisive battles would be fought. This is the story they never taught you in history class. The situation in December 1941 was far more desperate than most Americans realized. Japan controlled the Pacific. Germany controlled Europe. Britain was being bombed nightly by the Luftwaffe. The Soviet Union was reeling from Operation Barbarossa, with German tanks threatening Moscow itself. The Axis powers seemed unstoppable. America had an army smaller than Portugal's. The military had been starved of funding throughout the 1930s. Factories that should have been producing tanks were still making automobiles. Shipyards that should have been launching aircraft carriers were building luxury liners. The arsenal of democracy existed mostly on paper and in Roosevelt's speeches. Into this chaos came Winston Churchill. He crossed the Atlantic on a British battleship dodging German submarines for 9 days because he understood something crucial. Whoever controlled American industrial might would control the outcome of the war, and Churchill intended to control it. His strategy was brilliant and ruthless. He would charm Roosevelt. He would dazzle Washington with British sophistication and centuries of imperial experience. He would make himself indispensable to the American president, and through that relationship, he would ensure that American blood and treasure flowed toward British strategic objectives. The Mediterranean, North Africa, the Middle East, the soft underbelly of Europe. Churchill wanted to nibble at the edges of Nazi power to preserve British colonial interests, to avoid the catastrophic casualties of another Western front, like the one that had devastated Britain in World War I. What he did not want was a direct assault across the English Channel into France. Too risky, too bloody, too likely to fail. But there was a problem with Churchill's strategy. It would prolong the war by years. It would cost hundreds of thousands of additional lives. It would leave the Soviet Union to bear the brunt of German military power, while British and American forces chased around the periphery of Hitler's empire. And one American general saw through it all. George Marshall was not a charismatic man. He did not smoke cigarettes at jaunty angles like Roosevelt. He did not deliver roaring speeches like Churchill. He was tall, quiet, utterly uninterested in personal glory. He refused to laugh at jokes he did not find funny, even when the President of the United States was the one telling them. Early in their relationship, Roosevelt had made the mistake of calling him George. Marshall's response was so cold, so immediate, that Roosevelt never used his first name again. This was a man who could not be charmed, could not be bullied, could not be manipulated through flattery or political pressure. Marshall had risen through the army during the lean years when military officers were treated as irrelevant relics of a violent past. He had watched the service he loved decay through neglect. He had studied military history obsessively, particularly the disasters that occurred when political considerations overrode sound strategy. He knew what happened when wars were fought to serve imperial interests rather than military objectives. And now he was watching it happen again, right in front of him, in the White House itself. For 3 days after Churchill's arrival, Marshall observed the situation with growing alarm. British officers ascended the stairs to Roosevelt's quarters freely. They carried red leather briefcases filled with strategic plans. They had private meetings with the president. They were shaping his thinking, his priorities, his understanding of how the war should be fought. American officers waited downstairs. They were brought up only when summoned. They were not present for the crucial early discussions that would determine Allied strategy for years to come. Marshall understood what this meant. The British were establishing a dynamic where they led and America followed, where they determined strategy and America provided resources, where their colonial priorities would be dressed up as sound military planning and sold to an American president who was enchanted by Churchill's brilliance and theatrical charm. It was a trap, and Roosevelt was walking right into it. The evening of the confrontation, snow was falling on Washington. The White House looked peaceful from outside, its columns dusted with white, its windows glowing with warm light. Inside, Marshall stood in the hallway outside Roosevelt's study, his tall frame rigid, his blue eyes fixed on the door. He could hear British voices inside, the rustle of papers. Churchill's portable war room was operating at full capacity. British plans were being presented, British priorities were being advocated, and American military leadership was locked out. Captain James Whitmore, one of Marshall's trusted junior officers, appeared at his elbow. "Sir, the President has asked for you." Marshall took the intelligence folder Whitmore was carrying without looking at it. "Tell the President I will be along shortly." Whitmore hesitated. "Sir," he specified immediately. "Then he will have to wait 5 minutes." The young officer's eyes widened, but he knew better than to argue. Marshall walked to the window and looked out at the snow-covered lawn. He thought about the young men training in camps across America. Farm boys and factory workers learning to march and shoot because their country needed them. He thought about where those boys would be sent, what battles they would fight, how many would die. And he made his decision. When Marshall finally entered Roosevelt's study, Churchill was there occupying the best chair, brandy in hand, looking remarkably comfortable for a man whose nation was being bombed nightly. Roosevelt sat behind his desk cigarette holder at its familiar angle, surrounded by maps showing a world being torn apart. General Marshall Roosevelt began. "We have been discussing operations in North Africa. The Prime Minister has some interesting proposals." Marshall remained standing. A subtle power move that both men immediately recognized. "Mr. President, before we discuss operations, I need to address a matter of procedure." Churchill's expression shifted from jovial to guarded. Roosevelt's politician instincts sensed trouble ahead. Sir Marshall continued, "I cannot in good conscience participate in strategic planning when British officers have unrestricted access to your quarters and American military staff do not. It creates an imbalance that serves neither our military effectiveness nor our national interests." The room fell silent. Churchill slowly set down his brandy. His famous bulldog expression hardened into something more calculating. "General, surely you understand that the war room is merely an administrative convenience. It allows me to maintain contact with London to coordinate with my staff across thousands of miles of dangerous ocean. There is no conspiracy here." "I understand perfectly what it is," Prime Minister Marshall replied evenly. "It is a command center in the heart of the American White House, operated exclusively by British personnel influencing the most powerful man in the world, while his own military chiefs wait in hallways like supplicants. It is a physical manifestation of an assumption that Britain leads and America follows. Roosevelt leaned forward, his legendary charm engaging. "General Marshall, I assure you that no one questions American sovereignty or your vital role." Mr. President Marshall interrupted. Something he rarely did. The shock of it rippled through the room. "I will not stand here and pretend that what is happening upstairs is acceptable. You asked me to build an army. I am building it. You asked me to plan how to defeat Germany. I am planning it. But I cannot do either if the British are conducting their own separate war from your bedroom, while American officers are treated as junior partners in their own capital." The silence that followed was profound. Outside, the snow continued to fall. A clock chimed somewhere in the building. Churchill looked like he had been slapped. Roosevelt looked like he was calculating, weighing political costs against military necessities. Then something unexpected happened. Roosevelt smiled. Not his political smile. Something genuine. Almost relieved. As if Marshall had voiced something the president himself had been feeling but could not articulate. "You are absolutely right, General. Harry." Harry Hopkins appeared from a side door. Roosevelt did not wait for questions. "See to it that General Marshall and his staff have equivalent access to the second floor. Have someone set up an American war room adjacent to the British one. If we are going to plan this war together, we need equal footing." Churchill started to object, then stopped himself. He was many things, but he was not foolish. He needed American industry, American manpower, American everything. He could not afford to push this confrontation further. A sensible arrangement Churchill conceded, raising his brandy with theatrical grace. To partnership. Genuine partnership between equals. But Marshall did not raise a glass. He had none, and he did not smile. Because he had not won what truly mattered. The immediate insult was addressed, but the larger battle, the battle over how to fight the war itself, remained unresolved. In the weeks that followed, Marshall watched as plans for North Africa took shape despite his objections. He saw the peripheral strategy he had warned against gaining momentum. In desperation, he sent Roosevelt a memo suggesting that if America could not fully commit to attacking Germany directly through France, perhaps they should focus on Japan in the Pacific instead. It was leverage. A threat. The strategic equivalent of flipping over the game board. Roosevelt understood it as such. Understood that Marshall was willing to blow up the entire European strategy rather than accept a fundamentally flawed approach. But something else was happening too. Something subtle. Roosevelt was learning. He was watching how Marshall stood his ground, how he refused to be charmed or bullied. The president was beginning to understand that Marshall's stubbornness was not obstinance, but integrity. The rarest commodity in Washington. That December night changed everything. A line had been drawn, invisible but real. It said that America would be partner, not subordinate. That this new world power would forge its own path. That respect must flow both ways, or it is not respect at all. Marshall had proven something essential. That sometimes the most important battles are fought not with weapons, but with silence. With refusal. With simply standing in a hallway and saying no when everyone expected yes. But this was only the beginning, because the real war, the war over strategy, over where and how millions of Americans would fight and die, that war was just getting started. Churchill had not surrendered his vision. He had merely retreated temporarily. North Africa was still coming. The Mediterranean strategy was still advancing. The direct assault on France that Marshall believed would end the war decisively was being delayed month after month. And in part 2, we will see how Marshall fought that larger battle. How he clashed with Churchill again and again over the next 3 years. How his stubborn insistence on the cross-channel invasion would ultimately be vindicated on the beaches of Normandy, and how his refusal to compromise on principle would cost him the one thing he wanted most. The question that remained after that December night was simple but profound. Could one man's integrity reshape the course of the greatest war in human history? The answer would take years to reveal, and it would surprise everyone. In part 1, we witnessed something extraordinary. General George Marshall. The quiet, uncharismatic Army Chief of Staff stood in a White House hallway and refused to enter a room. That single act of defiance forced President Roosevelt to establish equal access for American military officers. It drew a line that said America would be partner, not subordinate. But winning access to the room was only the beginning. Because inside that room, a far more dangerous battle was being waged. A battle over strategy. A battle over where millions of American soldiers would fight and die. And Marshall was losing. Here is a statistic that should haunt you. Between January 1942 and June 1944, the Allies launched major operations in North Africa, Sicily, and Italy. Churchill's peripheral strategy. During those 30 months, over 150,000 Allied soldiers became casualties in Mediterranean operations. The direct assault on France that Marshall believed would end the war was delayed again and again and again. Every month of delay meant more Soviet soldiers dying on the Eastern Front, more concentration camp victims murdered, more resources consumed, more opportunities for Germany to strengthen its Atlantic defenses. And this is the story of how one stubborn American general fought a 2.5-year war inside conference rooms to save his country from fighting the wrong war in the wrong places. This is where everything became worse. The Arcadia Conference began on December 22, 1941, just 2 weeks after Pearl Harbor. 23 British officers arrived in Washington with Churchill. They came prepared. They had detailed plans. They had coordinated positions. They had rehearsed their arguments. The Americans had nothing comparable. Marshall's staff was scrambling to understand the global situation. The War Department was still reorganizing. American strategic planning was months behind British preparation. Churchill moved fast. Within days, he had Roosevelt's agreement to a Germany-first strategy. This sounded reasonable. Germany was the stronger enemy. Defeating Hitler took priority over defeating Japan. But Germany first meant nothing without answering the crucial question: where would Germany be attacked? And on this question, Churchill had very specific ideas. His first target was North Africa. Operation Gymnast. British forces were already fighting Rommel in Libya. Churchill wanted American troops to land in French North Africa, secure the Mediterranean, and squeeze the Axis from the south. Marshall saw this for what it was: a trap. North Africa would not defeat Germany. It would protect British colonial interests in Egypt and the Suez Canal. It would require massive shipping to supply forces thousands of miles from home. It would consume resources desperately needed for the real objective. And it would delay the cross-channel invasion by at least a year, probably longer. Marshall made his case directly to Roosevelt. Mr. President, every division we send to North Africa is a division that cannot land in France. Every ship supplying Mediterranean operations is a ship that cannot carry invasion forces across the English Channel. The Germans know this. They want us scattered across peripheral theaters. They want us fighting in deserts and mountains where our industrial advantage means nothing. Roosevelt listened. He nodded. He seemed to agree. Then Churchill invited the president for evening drinks. Just the two of them. No military advisors present. The next morning, Roosevelt seemed less certain about Marshall's direct approach. The Prime Minister made some excellent points, he told his Chief of Staff. Perhaps we should consider a more gradual strategy. Marshall felt the ground shifting beneath him. Churchill was not just presenting strategic arguments. He was building a personal relationship with Roosevelt that transcended military logic. Two aristocrats, two politicians, two men who understood each other in ways that a rigid army officer never could, and Marshall could not compete on that battlefield. By February 1942, Marshall realized he needed allies. He found one in an unexpected place. Dwight D. Eisenhower was a relatively unknown brigadier general working in the War Plans Division. He had never commanded troops in combat. He had spent years in staff positions learning the bureaucratic machinery of the Army. Many considered him a paper pusher, not a warrior. But Eisenhower had something Marshall desperately needed: political instincts combined with strategic clarity. He could navigate between competing egos while keeping sight of military objectives. He understood that winning arguments required more than being right. Marshall summoned Eisenhower to his office. "What do you think we should do about the Pacific situation?" Eisenhower had prepared for this question. He knew it was a test. He also knew that Marshall valued honesty above flattery. "Sir, the Pacific is important. But Germany is the main enemy. If we scatter our forces trying to defend everything, we will lose everywhere. We need to hold in the Pacific with minimum resources and concentrate everything possible against Hitler. And the only way to defeat Hitler is to attack through France. Everything else is a distraction." Marshall studied the younger officer for a long moment. Eisenhower had just said exactly what Marshall believed. More importantly, he had said it clearly and without hedging. "I agree," Marshall replied. "Now help me convince the president." Together, Marshall and Eisenhower developed a comprehensive plan for the cross-channel invasion. They called it Operation Roundup, scheduled for spring 1943. They also developed a contingency plan called Sledgehammer, a smaller emergency invasion in 1942 if the Soviet Union appeared about to collapse. Marshall brought this plan to Roosevelt in April 1942. He brought charts, statistics, detailed logistics, everything the president needed to understand why the direct approach was militarily superior. Roosevelt approved the plan. He sent Marshall and Harry Hopkins to London to secure British agreement. This was the moment of truth. If Churchill agreed to round up, the war would follow Marshall's vision. American troops would land in France in 1943. The war might end by 1944. But Churchill had no intention of agreeing. Marshall arrived in London on April 8, 1942. The British received him with elaborate courtesy. State dinners, tours of war facilities, meetings with the king. Churchill personally escorted Marshall through bombed London neighborhoods, showing the devastation the Luftwaffe had inflicted. It was brilliant psychological manipulation. Churchill was reminding Marshall that Britain had suffered, that Britain had fought alone, that Britain had earned the right to determine strategy. The formal meetings began on April 14th. Marshall presented Operation Roundup with precision and confidence. He laid out the troop requirements, the shipping needs, the timeline, the expected casualties. He showed how American industrial production could support a 1943 invasion. The British military chiefs listened politely. They asked detailed questions. They took careful notes. Then they systematically demolished every assumption. General Alan Brooke, chief of the Imperial General Staff, led the counterattack. He was brilliant, acerbic, and absolutely convinced that a 1943 cross-channel invasion would be catastrophic. He questioned American training. He questioned American equipment. He questioned whether American officers had the experience to conduct such a complex operation. "The Germans have 50 divisions in France," Brooke argued. "What happens when our landing forces hit the beaches? Do we have enough trained soldiers to establish a beachhead? Enough landing craft to maintain supply? Enough air cover to prevent Luftwaffe attacks?" Marshall had answers for every question. But he could feel the room turning against him. The British had fought the Germans. The Americans had not. Experience trumped planning in these discussions. After 4 days of meetings, Churchill delivered the final blow. He agreed to Operation Roundup in principle. But he attached conditions that made 1943 impossible. More training required, more equipment needed, more landing craft to be built. And in the meantime, why not consider operations in North Africa? Marshall flew back to Washington, having won nothing. The British had agreed to words while gutting the substance. Roundup was officially approved, but practically dead. What happened next revealed Marshall's true character. He did not give up. He did not accept defeat. He escalated. In July 1942, Marshall sent Roosevelt a memorandum that shocked Washington. If the British continued to refuse meaningful operations against Germany and Europe, he wrote, the United States should redirect its primary effort to the Pacific. We should concentrate against Japan, and leave Britain to fight Germany with whatever resources remain. It was a threat. Marshall was telling Roosevelt that he would rather abandon the European theater entirely than waste American lives on peripheral operations that served British imperial interests. Roosevelt was furious. He summoned Marshall to the Oval Office. "George," he began, then corrected himself. "General Marshall, I cannot accept this recommendation. We have committed to defeating Germany first. We have promised Churchill. We have promised Stalin. This memorandum would destroy the alliance." Marshall stood his ground. "Mr. President, I would rather fight the wrong war effectively than the right war ineffectively. If we cannot attack Germany directly, then we should not pretend that chasing around the Mediterranean accomplishes anything meaningful. The British want to preserve their empire. That is not an American war aim." The room fell silent. Roosevelt studied his chief of staff for a long moment. This was insubordination dressed in logic. Marshall was forcing the president to choose between his general and his ally. Roosevelt chose neither. Instead, he sent Marshall and Admiral Ernest King to London with new instructions. Convince the British to accept Sledgehammer, the emergency 1942 cross-channel attack. If Britain refused, Roosevelt would reluctantly accept North Africa. It was a compromise that satisfied no one. And Marshall knew what it meant. The British would never accept Sledgehammer. They would demand North Africa, and his vision of a 1943 invasion would die. He was right. The London Conference of July 1942 was a massacre. Churchill and Brooke rejected Sledgehammer within hours. They presented overwhelming arguments about German strength in France. They showed intelligence estimates. They quoted casualty projections. Marshall fought every point. He challenged assumptions. He questioned British intelligence. He accused them of prioritizing colonial interests over defeating Hitler. None of it mattered. On July 24, 1942, the combined chiefs of staff agreed to Operation Torch, the invasion of French North Africa. Marshall's direct approach was dead. Churchill's peripheral strategy had won. Marshall returned to Washington in bitter defeat. He had spent 7 months fighting for a strategy he believed would win the war quickly and save hundreds of thousands of lives. He had lost. But here is what separates Marshall from ordinary men. He did not sulk. He did not sabotage. He did not undermine the decision through passive resistance. He executed Operation Torch with the same dedication he would have given Operation Roundup. He appointed Eisenhower to command the North African operation. He ensured American forces were properly equipped and trained. He managed logistics across the Atlantic. He solved problems that threatened to derail the entire invasion. On November 8, 1942, American troops landed in Morocco and Algeria. The operation succeeded beyond expectations. Vichy French resistance collapsed quickly. Within 6 months, Axis forces in Africa surrendered. Churchill was triumphant. The peripheral strategy was working. North Africa was secured. Now he wanted Sicily, then Italy, then perhaps the Balkans. Marshall watched as each success made his direct approach seem less urgent. The Mediterranean was becoming an end in itself, consuming resources that should have been building for the cross-channel invasion. And the clock was ticking. Because across the English Channel, the Germans were not standing still. They were building. Every month of delay gave them more time to construct the Atlantic Wall, more time to lay mines, more time to position artillery, more time to train defenders. The beaches of Normandy were becoming deadlier by the day. Marshall knew that eventually there would be a cross-channel invasion. The war could not be won without it. But would it come in 1943, as he had planned, or 1944, or even later? And how many additional soldiers would die because of each month of delay? In January 1943, Roosevelt and Churchill met at Casablanca to plan the next phase of the war. Marshall arrived determined to force a decision on France. Surely now, with North Africa secured, the Allies could focus on the real objective. He was wrong again. Churchill wanted Sicily, then Italy. The soft underbelly of Europe, he called it. Knock Italy out of the war, and Germany would be weakened. The Mediterranean would be completely secured. Then perhaps in 1944 they could consider France. Marshall fought with everything he had. He presented statistics showing that Italian geography favored defenders. He argued that German troops would simply replace Italian ones. He predicted that Italy would become a grinding attritional campaign that consumed resources without achieving strategic victory. Brooke dismissed Marshall's arguments as the opinions of someone who had never fought the Germans. The British had experience. The Americans had theories. Casablanca ended with agreement to invade Sicily. The 1943 cross-channel invasion was officially postponed to 1944. Marshall had lost again. But something changed at Casablanca. Roosevelt began watching Churchill differently. The president noticed how the prime minister dominated meetings through eloquence and experience. How British positions always seemed to prevail. How American strategic preferences kept being overruled. And Roosevelt began to wonder if Marshall had been right all along. The Sicily invasion came in July 1943. It succeeded, but at high cost. Then came Italy in September 1943. Just as Marshall predicted, German forces replaced Italian ones. The Italian campaign became exactly the grinding slog he had warned against. Mountains and rivers and fortified positions that cost lives by the thousands. Meanwhile, Marshall kept building. He kept training divisions. He kept stockpiling equipment. He kept planning for the cross-channel invasion that would eventually come. And he kept fighting Churchill at every conference. At Quebec in August 1943. At Cairo in November. At Tehran, when Stalin himself demanded a second front. Finally, at Tehran, Marshall found an unexpected ally, Joseph Stalin. The Soviet dictator cared nothing for British colonial interests. He wanted German divisions pulled away from the Eastern Front. He wanted a real second front, not peripheral operations that barely distracted Hitler. "When will you invade France?" Stalin demanded. "Give me a date. Give me a commander." Churchill tried to deflect. There were conditions, preparations, uncertainties. Stalin was having none of it. He looked directly at Roosevelt. "Do you intend to invade France or not?" Roosevelt looked at Marshall, then at Churchill, then back at Stalin. "We will invade France in May 1944. Roosevelt declared. "Operation Overlord will proceed." Churchill had no choice but to agree. Stalin's pressure had accomplished what Marshall could not do alone, but there remained one crucial question. Who would command Overlord? Everyone assumed it would be Marshall. He had fought for this operation for 2 years. He had sacrificed his reputation defending it. He deserved the command that would make history. Roosevelt seemed to agree. He told Marshall that the command was his if he wanted it. Marshall characteristically refused to lobby for himself. He told Roosevelt that he would serve wherever the president thought he was most useful. It was perhaps the greatest mistake of his career, because while Marshall maintained his dignity, others were whispering to Roosevelt. They argued that Marshall was indispensable in Washington, that no one else could manage the global logistics of the war, that his steady hand was needed to coordinate all theaters, not just one. In December 1943, Roosevelt made his decision. He called Marshall into his office. The president looked uncomfortable, which was unusual for a man of his political skills. George Roosevelt began. "I feel I could not sleep at night with you out of the country." The command went to Eisenhower instead. Marshall accepted the decision without complaint. He congratulated Eisenhower. He continued his work. He gave no interviews expressing disappointment. He wrote no memoirs criticizing Roosevelt's choice. But those who knew him saw the cost. The command of Overlord would have been the crowning achievement of his career. He had earned it. He deserved it. And it had been given to his protege instead. This is where part 2 ends. But the story is far from over. Because Marshall's influence on D-Day would prove far greater than anyone expected. The planning, the logistics, the strategic decisions, all bore his fingerprints. And when the invasion succeeded, when those beaches were taken at terrible cost, the question would remain. How many soldiers died because the invasion came in 1944 instead of 1943? How many lives were lost in Sicily and Italy that could have been saved by Marshall's direct approach? These questions haunted Marshall for the rest of his life. But in Part 3, we will see how his vision finally triumphed, how Overlord succeeded beyond expectations, how the very strategy Churchill resisted became the strategy that won the war. And we will see something else entirely. Something that explains why Marshall, despite never commanding troops in battle, would become the only general in history to win the Nobel Peace Prize. The real war was about to begin. In Part 1, General George Marshall stood in a White House hallway and refused to enter Churchill's war room. He drew a line that established American equality in the Allied command structure. In Part 2, he fought a 2.5-year battle against Churchill's peripheral strategy. He lost North Africa, Sicily, Italy. One by one, his calls for direct invasion of France were overruled. The command of Operation Overlord went to Eisenhower instead of Marshall. But now, everything was about to change. June 6, 1944. The largest amphibious invasion in human history. Over 156,000 Allied troops crossing the English Channel. Nearly 7,000 naval vessels. More than 11,000 aircraft. The operation Marshall had fought for since December 1941 was finally happening. And the Germans were about to discover that 2.5 years of delay had not been enough to stop it. Here is a statistic that should make you pause. In the first 24 hours of D-Day, the Allies suffered approximately 10,000 casualties. That number sounds devastating. But German military planners had predicted 60,000 Allied casualties on the first day alone. They believed the invasion would fail on the beaches. They were catastrophically wrong. And this is where Marshall's vision finally triumphed over Churchill's doubts. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt commanded German forces in Western Europe. He was 68 years old, a veteran of both World Wars, a man who had conquered France in 1940, and believed he could defend it in 1944. When reports of the Normandy landings reached his headquarters, Rundstedt faced an impossible situation. For months, German intelligence had been deceived by Operation Fortitude, an elaborate Allied deception that convinced Hitler the real invasion would come at Pas-de-Calais. Even as American soldiers bled on Omaha Beach, Hitler refused to release panzer reserves because he believed Normandy was a feint. Rundstedt knew better. He recognized immediately that this was the main assault. He demanded permission to counterattack with every available tank division. Hitler said no. Wait for Calais. By the time Hitler finally released the panzers, it was too late. Allied air superiority made daylight movement suicidal. German tank columns that tried to reach Normandy were strafed and bombed into wreckage. Bridges were destroyed. Rail lines were cut. The reinforcements that might have pushed the Allies back into the sea arrived piecemeal, too late, too weak. Within 1 week, the Allies had landed 326,000 troops. Within 1 month, over 1 million. The beachhead that German planners thought impossible had become an unstoppable flood. Rundstedt called Hitler's headquarters with a blunt assessment. "What shall we do? Make peace, you fools." He was relieved of command the next day, but the damage was done. Marshall's strategy was working exactly as he had predicted. A concentrated thrust into France was bleeding Germany faster than years of peripheral operations ever could. In 6 weeks of Normandy fighting, the Germans suffered over 200,000 casualties, more than all of North Africa, Sicily, and Italy combined. The peripheral strategy had cost the Allies 30 months and 150,000 casualties to knock Italy out of the war. The direct approach was destroying German combat power at 10 times that rate. Churchill watched these developments with complicated emotions. He had resisted this invasion for years. He had warned of catastrophic casualties on the beaches. He had predicted another Gallipoli, another Somme, another generation of young men slaughtered in frontal assaults. He had been wrong, and Marshall had been right, But this was not the only challenge Marshall faced that summer. Even as Normandy succeeded beyond expectations, a crisis erupted that threatened to derail everything Marshall had built. The problem was logistics. The Allies were advancing faster than their supply lines could support. Every tank needed fuel. Every soldier needed ammunition. Every wounded man needed medical evacuation. And all of it had to flow through the narrow corridor of Normandy beaches and the single captured port of Cherbourg. By August 1944, Allied armies were literally running out of gas. General George Patton's Third Army, racing across France with spectacular speed, was forced to halt because fuel trucks could not keep pace with his tanks. Montgomery's British forces faced similar shortages. The liberation of Paris consumed supplies that should have gone to combat units. Eisenhower faced an impossible choice. He could concentrate all available supplies on one commander and let that force punch through to Germany. Or he could spread resources among all armies and advance on a broad front slower but more secure. Patton demanded priority. Give me the fuel and I will be in Berlin in 2 weeks. Montgomery made the same demand. His Operation Market Garden would use airborne troops to seize bridges in the Netherlands, opening a path into the German heartland. Eisenhower chose the broad front approach. He split resources among competing commanders. Neither Patton nor Montgomery received enough to achieve decisive breakthrough. Some historians argue this decision prolonged the war by 6 months. Others argue it prevented a catastrophic overextension that could have led to disaster. The debate continues 80 years later. But in Washington, Marshall watched with growing concern. He had fought for 2.5 years to get the direct approach adopted. Now that it was working, operational decisions were squandering the advantage. The war that might have ended in 1944 would drag into 1945. More lives lost, more resources consumed, more time for German secret weapons to mature. And the Germans were not passive victims. They were adapting. In December 1944, Hitler launched his last great offensive. The Battle of the Bulge. 3 German armies, over 400,000 troops, smashed into American lines in the Ardennes forest. Complete surprise. American units were overrun. Entire regiments surrendered. For 2 weeks it appeared the Germans might actually split the Allied armies and repeat their 1940 triumph. Marshall received the news in Washington with characteristic calm. He had built the army that was now fighting for survival in frozen forests. He had trained the officers who would have to stop the German assault. He had created the replacement system that would feed fresh troops into the battle. But he could not command them directly. That was Eisenhower's job now. All Marshall could do was ensure the resources kept flowing. The Battle of the Bulge became the largest battle in American military history. Over 600,000 American troops engaged. Nearly 90,000 American casualties. The Germans lost over 100,000 men and irreplaceable tanks and aircraft. By January 1945, the offensive had failed. Germany had spent its last reserves on a gamble that came agonizingly close to success, but ultimately achieved nothing except delaying the inevitable. Now the real payoff of Marshall's strategy became clear. The cross-channel invasion had done exactly what Marshall predicted. It created a second front that Germany could not sustain. Every division fighting in France was a division not fighting the Soviets. Every tank destroyed in Normandy was a tank not defending Berlin. Every aircraft shot down over the beaches was an aircraft not protecting German cities. The numbers told the story. Between June 1944 and May 1945, Germany suffered approximately 1.5 million casualties on the Western Front. Another 2 million were killed or captured by the Soviets in the same period. The Wehrmacht was being ground to dust between 2 millstones. Compare this to the peripheral strategy. North Africa, Sicily, and Italy together inflicted perhaps 500,000 Axis casualties over 2.5 years. The direct approach inflicted 3 times that in less than 1 year. Marshall had been right all along. The fastest way to defeat Germany was to attack Germany directly. Every month of delay in launching that attack cost lives. Every peripheral operation prolonged the war and increased total casualties. But being right brought no satisfaction. March 1945. The Allies crossed the Rhine. German resistance was collapsing. Hitler retreated to his bunker in Berlin, issuing orders to armies that no longer existed, demanding counterattacks from divisions that had been destroyed months earlier. Marshall tracked the final campaigns from Washington. He coordinated supply shipments. He managed the flow of replacements. He dealt with the endless political complications of coalition warfare. And he prepared for what came next. Because Marshall understood something that many did not. Winning the war was only the beginning. Someone would have to win the peace. Europe was in ruins. Entire cities had been reduced to rubble. Millions of refugees wandered homeless. Economies had collapsed. Infrastructure was destroyed. Starvation threatened populations that had survived years of bombing and occupation. If the Allies simply walked away, Europe would collapse into chaos. Communism would spread into the vacuum. The victory purchased with so much blood would be squandered. Another war would become inevitable within a generation. Marshall began thinking about reconstruction even before Germany surrendered. April 12, 1945. Franklin Roosevelt died. The president who had led America through the Depression and the war was gone. Harry Truman, a man with almost no foreign policy experience, suddenly found himself commander-in-chief. Truman's first instinct was to rely on the men Roosevelt had trusted, and no one had Roosevelt's trust more than George Marshall. Within weeks, Truman was calling Marshall the greatest living American. He consulted the general on every major decision. When Marshall spoke, Truman listened with a respect he showed few others. This relationship would shape the post-war world. May 8, 1945. Victory in Europe. The war Marshall had planned for, fought for, sacrificed for, was finally won. Germany surrendered unconditionally. Hitler was dead. The Nazi regime that had murdered millions was destroyed. But Marshall's work was not finished. Japan still fought. The Pacific War continued with undiminished ferocity. Kamikaze attacks were inflicting terrible casualties on the American fleet. The planned invasion of Japan was projected to cost over 1 million Allied casualties and potentially millions of Japanese deaths. Marshall supported the use of atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. It was a decision that haunted him. But he believed, as did most military planners, that the bombs would end the war faster and with fewer total deaths than an invasion. On August 15, 1945, Japan surrendered. The Second World War was over. George Marshall had served as Army Chief of Staff for the entire duration of American involvement. He had built an army from almost nothing to over 8 million soldiers. He had managed logistics across 2 oceans and 5 continents. He had navigated the political minefields of coalition warfare with Britain, the Soviet Union, and dozens of smaller allies. He had never commanded troops in combat. He had never heard shots fired in anger during this war. He had never received the glory that went to Eisenhower, Patton, MacArthur, and the other field commanders. But those who understood how wars are truly won knew the truth. Marshall had been the indispensable man. Without him, the American war effort would have collapsed into chaos. Without his steady hand, the alliance would have fractured. Without his strategic vision, the war might have lasted years longer and cost millions more lives. Winston Churchill, who had opposed Marshall on strategy for 3 years, delivered perhaps the most accurate assessment. Churchill called the American general the organizer of victory. He meant it as the highest compliment. He recognized that Marshall's contribution, though less dramatic than battlefield heroics, was ultimately more important. Eisenhower went further. He credited Marshall with being the single individual most responsible for Allied victory. Not himself, not Patton, not Montgomery, Marshall. These assessments were not flattery. They were recognition of a fundamental truth. Modern wars are won by logistics, by organization, by the steady accumulation of advantages that eventually become overwhelming. Marshall understood this. He built the machinery that made victory possible, and he did it while fighting political battles almost as difficult as the military ones. November 1945. George Marshall resigned as Chief of Staff. He was 65 years old. He had served his country for over 40 years. He was exhausted. He wanted nothing more than to retire to his home in Virginia and spend his remaining years in peace. That retirement lasted exactly 1 week. President Truman called. China was collapsing into civil war between nationalists and communists. Truman needed someone to mediate, someone with the prestige and skill to bring the warring parties together. Would Marshall go to China? Marshall went to China. He spent over a year trying to prevent the Chinese Civil War. He failed. The forces driving Mao and Chiang apart were too powerful for any mediator to overcome. But Marshall tried. He negotiated. He pressured. He threatened. He used every diplomatic tool available. When he returned to America in early 1947, he returned to a world in crisis. Europe was dying. The winter of 1946 to 1947 was the coldest in decades. Coal supplies ran out. Factories closed. Unemployment soared. Hunger spread. Communism was advancing everywhere, offering desperate populations an alternative to the chaos of failed capitalism. Truman needed a solution. He needed someone who could design and implement a plan to save Europe from collapse. He turned to George Marshall one more time. In January 1947, Marshall became Secretary of State. He was 66 years old. He was tired. His health was failing. He had earned retirement a dozen times over, but his country needed him. And George Marshall never refused when his country called. What he did next would earn him something no other general in history has ever received. It would cement his legacy as not just a military genius, but a humanitarian visionary. It would save millions of lives and reshape the world order for generations. But that is a story for Part 4. Because the man who spent 3 years fighting to invade France, who sacrificed his own chance at military glory for the good of the alliance, who built the greatest military machine in human history, was about to embark on his most important mission. Not destroying a nation, but rebuilding a continent. And the question that remains is this: how does a warrior become a peacemaker? How does a man trained for destruction learn to create? How does someone who spent decades preparing for war find the wisdom to prevent the next one? The answer lies in everything Marshall had learned. In the hallways of the White House, where he refused to compromise his principles. In the conference rooms where he lost battles but maintained his integrity. In the quiet moments of defeat, when he chose to execute orders he disagreed with rather than sabotage the alliance. Character built in war would now be applied to peace. This story has one more chapter, and it may be the most important chapter of all, because what George Marshall did after the war ended would save more lives than everything he did during the war. It would prevent the next world war. It would create the prosperous democratic Europe we know today. And it would prove that the same man who stood in a hallway and said no could also stand before the world and say yes. Yes to hope. Yes to reconstruction. Yes to a future where former enemies became friends. That is the story of Part 4. The story they should teach in every school. The story of how one quiet, stubborn, principled man changed history twice. First, by helping win the deadliest war in human history. Then, by ensuring it would never happen again. In Part 1, George Marshall stood in a White House hallway and refused to enter Churchill's war room. He drew a line that established American equality in the Allied command. In Part 2, he fought for 2.5 years against Churchill's peripheral strategy, losing battle after battle in conference rooms while winning the argument of history. In Part 3, his vision triumphed on the beaches of Normandy, and the war he had planned for ended in total Allied victory. But what happened to the man who orchestrated all of this? The general who never commanded troops in combat, but was called the organizer of victory, the strategist who sacrificed his own chance at glory for the good of the alliance. This story has one final twist, and it is something no one could have predicted. Because George Marshall, the warrior who spent his entire adult life preparing for war, would achieve his greatest victory in peace. He would save more lives after the fighting stopped than during 4 years of global conflict. And he would receive an honor that no military commander in history has ever received before or since. The price of that honor would be everything he had left to give. January 1947. George Marshall was 66 years old. His health was failing. He had served continuously since 1939 through the most demanding years any American military leader had ever faced. He had earned retirement a dozen times over. He wanted nothing more than to tend his garden in Virginia and watch the world he had helped save find its way toward peace. That retirement lasted exactly 6 days. President Truman called. The situation in Europe was desperate. The Secretary of State position was vacant. Would Marshall serve one more time? Marshall did not hesitate. He never hesitated when his country called. He accepted the position and flew to Washington the next morning. What he found was terrifying. Europe was dying. The winter of 1946 to 1947 had been the coldest in a century. Coal supplies were exhausted. Factories stood idle. Unemployment had reached levels not seen since the Great Depression. In Germany, the average daily caloric intake had fallen below 1,500 calories, a starvation diet. In Britain, bread rationing was tighter than during the war itself, and everywhere Soviet influence was spreading. Communist parties were gaining strength in France and Italy. Greece was fighting a civil war against communist insurgents. Czechoslovakia was teetering. The victory purchased with so much blood was slipping away. Marshall traveled to Europe in March 1947 to see the situation firsthand. What he witnessed shocked him to his core. Cities still lay in rubble 2 years after the bombing stopped. Refugees wandered homeless by the millions. Children begged for food in the streets of nations that had once been the centers of Western civilization. This was not what he had fought for. This was not the future his soldiers had died for. Marshall returned to Washington with a radical idea. An idea that many called insane when they first heard it. An idea that would cost billions of dollars at a time when Americans were tired of paying for Europe's problems. He wanted to rebuild the entire continent, not just the victors, the losers too, including Germany, the nation that had started the war, the nation responsible for tens of millions of deaths. The political reaction was predictable. Senators demanded to know why American taxpayers should rebuild countries that had tried to destroy civilization. Isolationists argued that Europe's problems were Europe's problems. Veterans groups questioned why former enemies deserved American generosity. Marshall faced them all with the same quiet determination he had shown facing Churchill 5 years earlier. "Gentlemen," he told a congressional committee, "the world situation is very serious. Europe's requirements are so much greater than her present ability to pay that she must have substantial additional help or face economic, social, and political deterioration of a very grave character." He laid out the logic with military precision. A prosperous Europe would be a stable Europe. A stable Europe would resist communist expansion. A Europe rebuilt with American help would be an ally for generations. The alternative was chaos, revolution, and eventually another war. The cost of rebuilding Europe would be enormous, but the cost of not rebuilding Europe would be infinitely greater. On June 5, 1947, Marshall delivered a speech at Harvard University that would change the world. He outlined a program of American economic assistance to rebuild European economies. He invited European nations, including the Soviet Union and its satellites, to participate in developing a comprehensive recovery plan. The speech was only 11 minutes long. It contained no dramatic flourishes. Marshall read it in his usual flat, understated manner. Most Americans who heard it on the radio probably did not realize they were witnessing history, but European leaders understood immediately. British Foreign Secretary Ernest Bevin called it a lifeline to a sinking man. Within weeks, 16 European nations had gathered to develop a coordinated recovery program. The Soviet Union refused to participate, as Marshall had expected. Stalin saw the program for what it was, a strategic masterstroke that would bind Western Europe to American leadership for decades. He forbade his satellite nations from accepting American aid. This suited Marshall perfectly. The Marshall Plan, as it came to be called, would strengthen the West while isolating the Soviet bloc. It would create the economic foundation for NATO, for European integration, for the transatlantic alliance that continues to this day. Congress approved the European Recovery Program in April 1948. Over the next 4 years, the United States provided over $13 billion in economic assistance. Adjusted for inflation, that would be approximately $150 billion today. The results exceeded even Marshall's expectations. By 1952, European industrial production had risen 35% above pre-war levels. Agricultural output had increased dramatically. Trade between European nations had doubled. The communist threat had receded as prosperity spread. But the Marshall Plan did more than rebuild economies. It rebuilt relationships. Germany, the nation that had twice plunged Europe into war, was integrated into the Western community. Former enemies became partners. The cycle of revenge and war that had devastated Europe for centuries was finally broken. But Marshall's legacy extends far beyond the plan that bears his name. The strategic principles he established during World War II continue to guide American military thinking 80 years later. His insistence on concentration of force on direct approaches to strategic objectives, on the primacy of logistics and organization over tactical brilliance, these remain fundamental doctrines. Every American military operation since 1945 has been shaped by Marshall's organizational innovations. The Joint Chiefs of Staff system he helped create. The unified command structures he championed. The integration of military planning with political objectives. These were revolutionary concepts in 1942. They are standard practice today. His approach to alliance management remains a model for coalition warfare. Marshall understood that allies must be treated as genuine partners, not subordinates. He fought for American equality in the Allied command structure, not from national pride, but from strategic necessity. Effective coalitions require mutual respect. Without it, they fracture under pressure. The generals who led American forces in Korea, Vietnam, the Gulf War, Iraq, and Afghanistan all studied Marshall's methods. They learned from his successes and his failures. They applied his principles to new technologies and new enemies. Perhaps most remarkably, Marshall's vision of using American power to rebuild rather than simply destroy has become a cornerstone of American foreign policy. The occupations of Germany and Japan after World War II followed Marshall's template. Economic development, democratic institution, building integration into the Western Alliance. These strategies have been applied with varying success around the world ever since. When American forces toppled Saddam Hussein in 2003, military planners explicitly referenced the Marshall Plan as their model for reconstruction. That the execution fell far short of the original does not diminish the power of Marshall's example. It merely demonstrates how difficult it is to replicate genius. But the lesson Marshall's life teaches us is not primarily about strategy or organization or even statesmanship. It is about character. George Marshall possessed something increasingly rare in public life. He was incapable of compromising his principles for personal advancement. He would not laugh at jokes he did not find funny, even when the president told them. He would not lobby for positions he desired. He would not bend to political pressure or public opinion. This rigidity cost him dearly. It cost him the command of overlord, the position he deserved and wanted more than anything in his career. It cost him easy relationships with superiors who found his stiffness uncomfortable. It cost him the public fame that went to more charismatic figures like Eisenhower and Patton. But it gained him something more valuable: trust. When George Marshall spoke, people believed him. When he made a recommendation, people knew it was based on careful analysis rather than political calculation. When he disagreed with the president or the prime minister, they knew he was motivated by genuine conviction rather than bureaucratic maneuvering. This trust was his greatest asset. It allowed him to rebuild an army that had been neglected for decades. It allowed him to manage an alliance of competing egos and national interests. It allowed him to propose a radical reconstruction program and convince skeptical congressmen to fund it. Other innovators throughout history have shared similar characteristics. Billy Mitchell, who predicted the dominance of air power and was court-martialed for his persistence. Hyman Rickover, who created the nuclear navy despite institutional resistance. John Boyd, whose theories revolutionized fighter combat, but whose abrasive personality limited his influence. All of these men saw further than their contemporaries. All faced resistance from established hierarchies. All persisted despite personal cost because they believed they were right. Marshall was different in one crucial respect. He knew how to lose battles while winning wars. He accepted defeats on peripheral strategy without sabotaging the alliance. He executed operations he disagreed with faithfully and effectively. He understood that being right about everything matters less than being effective about what matters most. This wisdom is perhaps his greatest legacy. Not brilliant innovation, but sustained effectiveness. Not dramatic gestures, but consistent integrity. Not personal glory, but institutional accomplishment. And there is one final detail of Marshall's story that most people do not know. In 1953, George Marshall received the Nobel Peace Prize. He remains the only professional soldier in history to receive this honor. The man who had spent 45 years preparing for war, who had built the largest military force in American history, who had helped plan the destruction of Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan, was recognized for his contributions to peace. The Nobel Committee cited the Marshall Plan, specifically calling it one of the most constructive statesmanlike acts in history. But they also recognized something deeper. They understood that Marshall represented a different kind of military leadership, one that saw war as a means to peace rather than an end in itself. Marshall was too ill to attend the ceremony in Oslo. He sent an acceptance speech to be read on his behalf. In it, he reflected on his career and the lessons he had learned. There has been considerable comment over the awarding of the Nobel Peace Prize to a soldier, he wrote. I am afraid this does not seem as remarkable to me as it quite evidently appears to others. I know a great deal of the horrors and tragedies of war. I am convinced that man must do whatever is within his power to prevent such catastrophes. He continued with words that capture the essence of his character. The cost of war in human lives is constantly spread before me, written neatly in many ledgers, whose columns are gravestones. I am deeply moved to find some means or method of avoiding another calamity of war. Marshall died on October 16, 1959, at the age of 78. He had served his country for nearly half a century. He had helped win the greatest war in human history and then helped build a peace that has lasted 80 years. His funeral was attended by presidents and generals, foreign dignitaries, and ordinary citizens who understood that something irreplaceable had been lost. Eisenhower, the man who had received the command Marshall deserved, served as an honorary pallbearer. Churchill, the man who had opposed Marshall's strategy for 3 years, sent condolences praising the American as one of the great figures of the age. But perhaps the most fitting tribute came from Harry Truman, the president who had relied on Marshall during the most dangerous years of the early Cold War. He was the greatest military man that this country ever produced. Truman said, maybe the greatest military man of all time. Let us consider what George Marshall accomplished. He stood in a hallway and refused to enter a room establishing American equality in the Allied command structure. He fought for 2.5 years against a flawed strategy, lost repeatedly, but ultimately saw his vision vindicated. He built an army of 8 million from almost nothing. He managed logistics across 5 continents and 2 oceans. He held together an alliance of competing nations and egos. He proposed a reconstruction program that rebuilt a continent and prevented another world war. And he did all of this without ever seeking personal glory, without ever compromising his principles, without ever forgetting that his purpose was to serve his country, not himself. The Marshall Plan provided over $13 billion in aid and helped rebuild 16 nations. It created the economic foundation for NATO and European integration. It established a model for American engagement with the world that continues today. Economists estimate that the plan helped save millions of lives that would have been lost to starvation, disease, and civil conflict in a collapsed Europe. But the numbers do not capture what Marshall truly achieved. He proved that military power can serve humanitarian ends, that warriors can become peacemakers, that the same discipline and determination required to win wars can be applied to building peace. From a rigid army officer who refused to laugh at the president's jokes to the organizer of victory and architect of reconstruction, George Marshall proved that character is not what you do when the world is watching. It is what you refuse to do when refusing costs you everything. He stood in hallways when he could have sat in rooms of power. He said no when yes would have advanced his career. He accepted defeat gracefully while never abandoning his convictions. And in the end, he achieved more than the generals who won the glory he was denied. That is the power of integrity sustained over a lifetime. That is the legacy of a man who understood that how you fight matters as much as what you fight for. If you know another story like this, another moment when one person's stubborn refusal to compromise changed the course of history, share it in the comments. Because World War II was filled with such moments, filled with innovations dismissed as impossible, filled with ordinary people who accomplished extraordinary things because they refused to accept that the impossible was truly impossible. This channel exists to tell those stories, to remind us that history is not made by impersonal forces, but by individuals who chose to stand when others bent. Subscribe to discover more. And remember what George Marshall taught us through his extraordinary life. The greatest victories are not always won on battlefields. Sometimes they are won in hallways and conference rooms, in quiet moments of refusal when everyone expects accommodation. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply stand your ground and say no. And sometimes, if you are very fortunate and very persistent, that single word can change the world.